it. Well, thank you again for joining us, into our LinkedIn Live event. I'm Stanley Lee, CEO and founder of NestSwitch, and Sean Mahoney, my business partner. And today we are very grateful to have Alex Sharp, our long-term partner, have been working with us and coaching us for a number of years and help us to create a couple podcasts to guide us along with the GRC with his expertise. So I let Sean because Sean spent more time with Alex and talk about the details. So I'm going to sit back and try to take notes and learn more from Alex. Sean, please.
Hey, welcome, Alex. Alex Sharp is the CEO of Sharp Consulting. Alex has a very broad and deep background. That's not to say you're old, Alex, but a very deep background in cybersecurity and compliance and helping organizations understand their cyber risks and how to better manage their information security practices and controls from both the technical side and the governance side. And so Alex brings a lot of insight to the tactical application of things that we've talked about in the last two events that we've done with attorneys who have talked about the importance of cyber risk management, integrating it with enterprise risk management from the internal counsel of organizations, and then from a former SEC enforcement attorney as to what the challenges are and what his recommendations would be from his former position of enforcement against organizations. And now we're coming down to really kind of, Alex, how do we tackle some of these applications of appropriate cyber risk management in view of the new SEC cyber rule enforcements that are coming down as far as the enforcement side here in just a couple weeks.
The ultimate guy.
Yeah, all right. So, the question is, where do we start, right? And what's it really mean in the big picture? So, first of all, let's kind of frame it up a little. The SEC actually has been putting its cyber guidance out there for quite some time.
Right.
This is now finally a rule, right? So a lot of people are scrambling, going, "Oh, what's this materiality thing and all that?" It's like, well, go to the website, just Google. It's been out there for a while. These are very well-known, established practices. The difference is there's really two key things to keep in mind. The number one is it's now been it's gone from being a rule to it's gone from being guidance to being a rule,
Right.
which means it's enforceable. There's actions. It's real. It's real. The second thing is this is only one piece in the much larger puzzle. You know, we'll take it at the SEC level first. First of all, the SEC has three missions, and this is the first of three rules to be put in place, right? This one is effectively against publicly traded companies. It's also about private issuers, which is it deals with foreign companies that are, want to sell their stocks in the United States. So it's really about anybody who's an equity, right? They have something out there. But the other ones that follow are really around other market participants. So privately held, publicly traded, doesn't matter what role. If you are regulated by the SEC, there's a second rule on the way. The last bucket is all the folks that support that for efficient markets. So you start looking at what are the implications for, say, a cloud service provider who really knows nothing about the financial market. They don't do anything, that's kind of financial services except that they move some bits around. Well, they start becoming systemically important to the market, right? So we start seeing that. So first and foremost, what we're seeing is this is the first set of rules. So anybody anywhere should be paying attention to what's going on, whether you're privately held, publicly traded, market participant or not. Take a look at it, right? Because it's soon to be at your doorstep. The other piece is go up a notch. Just go up a notch. Back in March, April, I don't remember the official date anymore. The U.S. put out for the first time a cybersecurity strategy, and there's a series of pillars in there. But those pillars really boil down to 3 R's: responsibility, regulation, and resilience. What we're seeing out of the SEC is really the efforts of one regulator, the SEC, on what's in their purview. We are seeing similar actions out of pretty much every other regulator. And those regulators really fall into a couple of buckets because some have more regulatory authority than others. We are also seeing what's coming out of the SEC propagating globally. What a surprise. The United States is about a quarter of the global GDP. We're the single largest part of the global GDP. And frankly, we're the financial markets of the world, right? These are very basic facts. So the international body where all the regulators, the financial services regulators meet is called IOSCO. It's probably one of the most important things out there that 99.9% of the people have never heard of, but affects them every day. IOSCO more than likely is going to pick up what the SEC is doing, and we're going to see it propagate through, let's call it every other Western country and most of the non-Western countries, because they also have a desire for, well-behaved markets and capital formation and the like. Humans as investors, we like transparency. We don't, we like knowing what's going on. And if you think about it for a second, the lack of transparency is what caused the 2008 financial crisis. We locked up over counterparty risk, where one side of a trade did not know what the other side was holding. So we froze. We didn't know what to do. We couldn't assess the other side's risk. So in the US, what we did is we ramped up the balance sheet and we injected a huge amount of capital into the system because we did not have a solvency problem. We had a liquidity problem. And when you have excess cash, all sorts of problems go away, right? So we injected a ton of cash. We're seeing with the cyber rule in principle does not differ from any of that. So I know I just spewed out a lot, and I'm sure.
Great introduction. I think this is great introduction. And you mentioned certain part about, like I always try to break it down very simple with the 5 W's, right? You mentioned the who, you mentioned some of the why. And of course, that you actually, the interesting point about you bringing it back to mortgage-backed security, the financial crisis, the 2007, 2008, because it's one thing that I learned through my discussions with our peers in this industry about cyber risk governance is about lack of visibility. And that also triggered what you're talking about. Why SEC now, there is never enough regulatory issues or regulations. Why are they doing all of that? What are the purpose? The purpose, I believe, and then you can correct me, please, Alex, if I'm wrong, is to drive that transparency and the accountability. Now, like you said, bringing up to a notch, now the personal liabilities involved with the board, and there's
all right, let's put that aside for a second.
Okay.
Let's chew through all the points you're throwing out here.
I would love to.
So Sean, keep a list. Yeah. Put the personal liability in the side here.
Okay.
Right.
So the visibility is what I believe by talking to my observations aggregated by all my conversation. There are 3 groups of stakeholders the business executive, the governors, and the technologists, they all try to improve one of our resilience, right? Now, who is responsible for it? That's one part of my question to you. And the other question to you is, when they take on this responsibility, well, who should be deciding making the decisions? And that, when it comes to tying it into the visibility. Now, the technologists, they look at their objective is, amount of cyber attacks that they have to deal with. The governors, that they have to look at, the type of compliance that applicable to their organization. And of course, the business executive, they all have to look at the financial responsibilities, right? But among those dialogues and the narrative that they, from what I heard, from what I understand, how do they visualize it? How can they look at it from their responsibility perspective, based on their decision making process, to come up with a, with a roadmap, with a plan of attack that can satisfy the GRC controls as well as the technical controls? At the end of the day, from my point of view as a technologist, that I got to look at, okay, why do we have all this data breach? Because of all these type of attack vectors. So let's start with that.
All right. So this is no longer an hour session. It's about a month and a half. And I'm good with all of it. So we can keep right on going. I'm easy.
We'll have another section.
Let's
to
just
break
kind
it
of
down.
march through it. So first of all, you talk about the W's. There's actually a name for that. That's called the Kiplinger model. You can actually look it up. It's and one of the reasons I bring it up is, now with cyber becoming a board conversation, one of the things that regulators look at is, do you have corporate policies? And the Kiplinger model is how you write your corporate policies to make sure that they address all the pieces. So it's funny you brought up the W's: who, what, where, why, and how, right? So let's go through. You talk about transparency. So you said visibility, but transparency. If you look at the SEC rules that were passed, what does it talk about? It talks about when disclosures need to be made and how. And they did not create separate criteria or separate mechanisms for cyber. They folded cyber into what existed, 10Ks and 8Ks. We're not going to talk about some of the permutations, based on size of business and whether you're international or not. But it was put right in there. And what's the gating criteria if something gets reported? It's material. And why do we use that? Well, first of all, that's the gating criteria SEC uses for everything. And the gating criteria is all about, would the shareholder want to know the information to make an informed decision, right? And there's official language about this. There's a Supreme Court decision about it. And guess when this law was put in place? Guess when that definition was put in place? Just take a guess.
In the 80s?
About the time of the Second World War.
Wow.
Right? So this is nothing new. It's new to technologists. It's new to the cyber folks. But this is very well understood, with a lot of legal precedent and a lot of oomph behind it. Right? So it's no accident that all this is being put in there, and the way it's being done. There's nothing new here. The other thing is, you talked about how one piece spreads to the other. I was talking about the financial crisis of 2008, but there's a lot of other examples related to that. Some have to do with technology, some don't. But you'll often hear the term contagion. Contagion is a fancy thing for what those of us in the risk management business would call systemic risk. Why does the action of one affect another? Right? So you talk about, you can look at the cloud, and we have two things effectively going on with the cloud. We're aggregating risk in the cloud, and the cloud is becoming a single point of failure. Right. And we could talk about some other things. Little factoid, everybody talks about satellite and we talk about cell phones and all that, but more data actually goes across the sea floor and undersea cable than goes through everything else. And a handful of years ago, there was an undersea earthquake that actually disrupted the markets in Asia because it took out some of the undersea cables. Well, the world has changed where, 15 years ago, if somebody got a cold on the other side of the world, we didn't think about, who's going to sneeze over here, but then we had a global pandemic, right? The things have changed and information travels faster. It doesn't need an airline ticket. It can find its way it can route wherever. Bits don't know borders. They don't know when they're crossing an international date line or going into another country. They just do what they do.
And hackers becomes an industry on their own.
Well, so that's the other thing. We talk about ransomware. Ransomware took off in 2016 because Bitcoin became prevalent. Up until that point, nobody considered a ransomware attack viable. By the way, that attack has been predicted since the 60s or 70s when we learned how to encrypt bulk data, remotely instead of doing it in line. But nobody thought it was viable because to perform that attack, you had to put a lot of cash in a duffel bag, probably take a helicopter, fly over someplace, drop the duffel bag, and you either arrested or shot the person that went to pick up the duffel bag.
So now, like you said, we know that we can continue to go on with the 5 Ws. Now let's talk about the how. This is what today's episode is, the ultimate guide. It's how do we fix it? Where do we start? Lots of people keep asking me, it's like, yes, I've been doing this. We spend X amount of money, investment, resources, educations and all of that. Well, how are we going to deal with these new regulatory issues, and how are we dealing with the, the more regulatory issues coming down the pipeline? Tell us how.
Well, let's walk through that, and we'll take it from the regulatory side. And I'm sure if we have more time, you're going to take it from the general side about where how do we become more resilient as an organization. So first of all, the regulations work for us and against us. Or maybe work for us and then cause us headaches. Maybe that's the better way of saying it. So one of the ways it works for us is if you read the National Cybersecurity Strategy and you look at the news, one of the things that's going on is we are shifting responsibility for vulnerabilities in the product away from the consumer to the product vendor or the service provider. Okay. Case in point, if you look at the numbers, Microsoft historically has had a disproportionate amount of vulnerabilities given its market share, right? And the numbers are on the side. You can argue why that is and why it isn't. So Microsoft has been criticized for this. Well, with the recent exploit of or recent compromise of email from the U.S. government, what happened? The U.S. government opened up 3 separate investigations. Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, and CISA are all looking into Microsoft. Did Microsoft do what it was supposed to do, and what is its liability? And we're seeing that across the board. We're also seeing enforcement of security by design and default, because historically, what did we do? Somebody bought a product, and if there was flaws in it, the person who bought it was responsible for patching and putting all these defenses around it. Think about a car. What if you're driving along in a car and it suddenly catches fire, and the product, the manufacturer said, "Not my problem. It wasn't on fire when I sold it to you." Right? So we're shifting that liability. So these regulations in some ways work for you. The other way it works for you is because we are talking about transparency. and we are talking about visibility, like you were saying, the organizations who have better cyber policies and cyber resilience over time are going to have better they're going to have better market share, they're going to have a better share price, a healthier share price. We have seen studies that show time and time again that when an organization is hit by a cyber incident, they tend to get more pricing, more pressure on pricing. There's churn on customers. There's a lot of things that go on. One study recently by McKinsey says that that in general consumers value price, delivery time, and the cyber policy of an organization equally, right? So you have that things work for you. On the downside, truthfully, it's like Thanksgiving dinner. We just had Thanksgiving. We are now taking cyber from the kids' table and we're putting them at the adult table. So the challenge we have is how do we integrate the cyber practices into existing GRC practices? I just put something out on this recently. The first thing to do, absolute first thing to do, is dust off your policy and practices around determining materiality and figure out, working with your cyber folks, so compliance, risk management, legal, all the people that are involved in determining materiality, get the cyber folks in the room, update that exercise for cyber, and start flowing that down into incident response.
Like what we've been talking about, first thing they need to dust off is their backup. Make sure they worked.
Well, you see, that's
from the technology side of me,
yeah.
right?
So
Like,
I was trying to stay focused on the regulatory side, but let's go even deeper than that. The average time to detect an incident in 2022, the 23 numbers aren't out yet, was a little over 200 days. But if you take, and that's about 7 months, so we'll talk in round numbers. If you take out the incidents, the ransomware incidents, because the hacker is telling you about them, that number goes up to 300 days, 10 months. So you have a bad guy in your enterprise doing bad things to you for about 10 months. And believe it or not, the 40% of incidents are reported by external third parties. About 27% is from the hacker themselves. So we're only detecting 1/3 of incidents. And now what we see with the backups, you bring up backups. Now that backups are working, we're storing from backups. The hackers are getting all sorts of upset because they're not getting paid. Because we're saying, hey, I got backups, I don't need you. So now they're starting to extort data, which attacks reputational risk. And what we're seeing is organizations are more upset about getting their reputation tinged than they are with just paying money. And now that they have to disclose it to shareholders, they're really paying attention.
Or they're getting turned in by the hackers to the
regulatory.
Yeah.
I'm curious how that's going to go because, first of all, I don't know. I kind of go down the road of, as a shareholder, I'm trying to figure out if there's such thing as an incident that I don't want to know about. Right? I'm trying to figure that one
The
out.
unknown is what we've been pitching as well too.
There
It's like,
you go.
yeah, but and then of course what we're talking about. Well, how with those so many layers that you already laid out. Where do we start? So you start saying that, okay, look at the policies and procedure from the GRC side. Where we from the technologists, yes, we know that within that 200-day, your backup might be already be tinted. but still, at least to check on making sure those backup works, right? So yes, it might be tinted, but of course, from a technology point of view, you can isolate it and run it, test it, and do a lot of different things of making sure that there is no 0 days is already reside. And one part of it is we talked about automations from, of course, the technology side to knowing the unknown from an automated perspective. And that's what we've been deploying, like pen tests, configuration assessments, all of these technology tool. It should be, that is the responsibility from the technologist. But what we're talking about as well now, back into the visibility, all these things that have been working on in an ongoing basis, like you said, on the, the cyber risk has been going on for the last 2 decades that I started working on this. All those data are not being captured, are not being utilized to provide the risk trending analysis. And that is where we talk about transparency, visibility, because nobody wants to talk about it up until now because of the regulations, the compliance. More becomes of a driving force.
Yeah.
Not saying
So
that all the investment are wasted, but I think that, this is part of, I think we all talking about the same thing. How can we bring it into that visibility, GRC side or technology side, bring those into the visibilities to start the communications and revisit the objective for the organization?
so there's a couple of pieces here. From a board perspective, and let's go with publicly traded boards because that's largely what the SEC is focused on. A board member actually has a couple of duties, and associated with those duties is liability. One of the duties is a duty of care. So the question becomes, how does the board get its nose into the cyber program without sticking its fingers in? Right? Because if the board is being prescriptive, they're not doing their jobs. Their job is to hire the right people, provide the right resource, provide alignment, do the right kind of measurement and analysis around it. We haven't figured that out yet. You also bring up another piece where there's a lot of debate. Maybe actually you brought up two pieces where there's a lot of debate. One of the issues when you have something like cyber, because we are dealing with things that are much more intangible, when you look at things like risk transfer, we have a lot of history. And we could figure out how to write a policy. But when you start talking about nation states who are the existential threat, that's considered an act of war, and it's not even covered by most policies. So how do you handle that? And part of that goes back to the national cybersecurity strategy, where it requires a whole of government approach, and we've actually restructured like parts of the Department of State. There's a wonderful part of the U.S. government that very few people have heard of called Cyber Command, which is our offensive cyber capability. There's a lot of relations at the global level, and indirectly, the SEC has actually created a mechanism by which we can bring an all of government response. So one of the things that doesn't get talked about is there's this 4-day rule, and everybody's upset about the 4-day rule. And having been through a situation where you have to create these disclosures, 4 days from the time you figure out its material to write these things is a lot less time than it sounds. But there's an exception. The Attorney General can make a decision that what you're experiencing and dealing with is related to national security, and the disclosure does not have to be made.
And on
So
top of that, I had a conversation pleasure with talking to an attorney general and they were talking about, hey, Stanley, I got like, this is one of the states, I'm not going to mention which state, but they said I got over 5,000 cases. I think that was like 2 years ago per year. You think that I'm going to go after every single one of them? No. The bottom line is, what we talking about changing the narrative is from plausible deniability into legally defensible evidence along the line with what you said earlier.
Well, don't
And
forget,
then
you also got the shareholders,
right,
right?
and that's
So
where the transparency comes in as well. But at
you
the
have
same time, what
activist investors. Go ahead.
and just last point, it's like I just want to see, but the Attorney General office just want to see which company are not following the best practice has been recommended for decades or years. And if you say I'm a small company, I only got 10 people in the company, of course they're not going to expect that you can follow everything on the NIST unless that you are a CMMC vendor, right? That you have these obligations to the CMMC regulatory issue when you might be categorized as a level 1. I don't know, depends on what they're supplying with that 10 people company. But at the same time, that's how they, balancing which case, which battle they want to fight with. It's like, okay, we know that, not every one of them is going to follow all the recommendations or the best practice. But case by case, that's where you're talking about, the shareholders. Hey, are you a publicly trading company, or you might be a mid-sized company, but have a lot of responsibility and has a lot to lose when your data get hacked. So that is part of what what several questions been popped up. So I want to ask along that line is, will the reporting of material cyber crimes potentially hurt a company because they are published? Will it cause companies to lie? I think that ties along with what we just said about the best practice. That's an interesting question in that.
Well, I would recommend, I would recommend the person that asked that question, I would go and give a call to the former CISO of SolarWinds or the CISO of Uber, because that actually has nothing to do with the cyber rule. That's called fraud.
Right.
And that's already, you go to jail for that. What cyber rule or not, you go to jail. What it's done now is it's really upped the game. It's upped the game in several different ways. And there's a lot of nuances to that, and there's a lot of debate over it. But the reality is there is absolutely no excuse any longer to say, I didn't know, whatever, because you have a duty of care. You're being paid to know. And if you don't know, there's a problem.
I'm a small business, Alex. It's like,
So let's go there. Remember, there's a difference between making a bad decision and fraud, right? The courts have sustained, and I'm not an attorney, but I deal with a lot of them.
Sorry.
And I'm told this all the time. You're allowed to make bad decisions. There's actually, I forgot the name of the law. It's out of it's a Delaware case, a very famous Delaware case. It might actually be not Caremark. It's something else. It says you are allowed to make bad decisions, but you're not allowed to lie about it, right? So, that's there. The other piece that comes on with this is it is now not only you that's culpable, right? So a CISO, this thing about, well, the CISO did this and I didn't know about it. And not really, folks. No, because this is a board discussion. It's a board decision. If you are a director or officer, and that's two different things. Directors are elected by shareholders. Officers are appointed by the board. If you're a director or officer, you are held to a higher standard, and cyber is no longer considered guidance. It is considered a business imperative.
and that leads into my, yeah, and that you answer my question. I'm a small business, but now with the technology, with the availability of building a cyber risk committee, having a fractional engagement with consultant like yourself, Alex, or there are other consultants that we also work with in law firms, that becomes a committee that can be addressing some of this issue,
Absolutely.
making sure that your organization, big or small, start guiding into that perspective. And the attorney general, even though when you get hacked, your data breach, the attorney general might look at these best practice you are trying to follow to basically not going after the prosecution. That I'm not an attorney either, but these are the best practice that what I've been sharing with our audience. Say, look, there are so many people in our community willing to help. That's the first thing, and that's why we have a group of 3,800 members now, within our group. And people say, whoa, how long have you been building this? No, within the last 18 months. Why? Because people are willing to share their insights.
Well, that means we have 20 minutes to get another 200. So we have a nice got a nice.
I think the point Alex, you and why we're working so closely together. I'm a technologist. I've been in this world for in 18 years, 20 years, 30 years, if you're counting my starting point. And I see a lot of what I said is a common sense, what I refer as a common sense. But common sense is not so common anymore. When I talk to you, Alex, it's like, okay, yeah, a lot of people don't see it that way. Don't see the visibility, how we can utilize in your existing data to paint that picture to identify the gap. It's very easy.
It is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I was going to say some people are going to yell at me. No, it's not. But it is easy.
Look, Stanley, if you look at the people who study this stuff around predicting who's right and who's wrong and who's going to succeed and all that, the number one indicator that you're going to succeed is people telling you you're going to fail. So, getting pushback is always a good thing. It's usually a sign that you're trying to break some glass and trying to move the ball forward. So let me hit two key points. Here's what we do know from a cyber perspective. When we treated cyber as a technology problem with a technology solution, we created incredibly strong technical defenses. We're solid. And what we're doing today, and this is one of the things the SEC and all the regulators are trying to do, but they can't write it down this way, is they're taking the technical defenses, pointing them to the adversary and saying, hit me here. So what's the adversary doing? They're saying, that's your strongest point of defense. I'm going around the edges. 82% of hacks in 2020, last year, began with a social engineering attack.
MGM.
Right? Vector. So north of 90%, some people would argue 100, north of 90% of all breaches, incidents, require a human to do something silly. Okay? Well, if we're just looking at the technology side and the hackers are saying that's too strong, let's focus on the other pieces, the process, the people, the organization, right? And if you notice where we're seeing all the regulations, all the standardization, everything going on across the industry, we're seeing a movement away from purely technology to the other pieces. And that's another driver behind the SEC. The other piece that's under all this is, I know the CSF has 5 phases, but they really come down to 3: protect, detect, defend. Protect, detect, recover. We protect really, really well. We only really detect about 30%, and it takes us a long time to do that. And we've become really good at recovering, but we burn out our resources in the process. So if you look at what's going on with regulations and standardization and all, in addition to moving away from purely technical defenses to the other aspects, we are also saying that we need to be resilient. Incidents happen. Let's acknowledge that. Let's detect faster. Let's recover quicker. So if you look at zero trust, and you can argue whether it's a buzzword or not, because there's valid arguments it's a buzzword, but it does have some good stuff underneath it. By the way, I think it became a buzzword once the federal government mandated it and put a lot of money behind it, because everybody suddenly wants to do zero trust washing, right? Like you have greenwashing and cyber washing, right? One of the fundamental pieces is that you have segmentation and you have access control in place. So when somebody does penetrate you, you assume they are, when they do get inside, you limit how broad the blast radius and how much damage they can do. And by doing that and limiting that, you also not only limit the attack, you detect it faster because you can look in smaller places, and you can recover quicker because you have less to deal with. Let's face it, a fire in a frying pan on your stove is a lot easier to put out than your entire house being engulfed. Right?
True.
Right? So these are all the things that are going on, and one of the challenges we're running into, and this is the point where I usually get nasty comments in the chat, is the people who have been beating the drum, the technology folks who've been beating the drum for years, saying, there is a problem, the sky is falling, it's going to rain, right? I'm trying to build an ark. I need your help building an ark. It's going to rain. Now that the world is waking up saying, oh, geez, you're right.
This is a good point, but I know that we can talk forever about this. But yes,
and we will.
Yeah,
we will.
We'll continue. The technologists, including one of the questions mentioned about the SBOM and all these technical controls. The way I look at it from my years of experience, it might not mean anything nowadays anymore, but it changes in 2020 because of the SolarWinds hack, because of all these,
21. Wasn't it 21?
Well,
no, 20,
20
right.
started, and then of course the effects start starting in 21. But most important is the tie in into the insurance, and the insurance folks now. Oh my goodness, we lost that cash cow. What are we going to do about it? How can we fix it? And then ties it back into why I said is easy to do, because there's a lot of data within your organizations, and all it needs to be extracted one way or the other, however you want to do it, and paint that picture. Stop painting that picture. Now, at the same time, what you're
Which, by the way,
addressing
is one of the reasons, if you notice, there's actually a little known act about the Cybersecurity Incident Reporting Act.
Well, one of the members talked about EO Executive Order 14028. I remember my wife was talking to me. I'm daydreaming about that. What is that all about?
Well, no, we'll go to the.
There are lots of guidelines. Yeah.
No, the reason this one's important is because there is a recognition that to do exactly what you're saying, we need to collect data cross-sector, cross-geography of organizations of all size.
Correct.
And
right on.
Nobody disagrees with that. But do you know what the pushback is? Large corporations look at the US government and said, why should I trust you with my data? You can't protect your own.
My answer to that is no, you don't have to share it. Starting to utilize the data within your organization.
Oh, well, that's a very true statement. Yeah.
Right. And you don't have to share anything. And that's what part of what our initiative in our open source as a data visualization. It's just a tool to visualize what is going on. At least the analogy, like Alex, you like to use analogy. So do we. So why are you buying Fitbits? Why are we buying Fitbits as a consumer? Back then, you used, the annual checkup. You go to the doctor, get your lab work done, get your measurements so they can see, the cholesterol level, this level, that level. Technology has changed. Now, I'm not saying that we can put all these things into a Fitbit, but at least that you can monitor that on an ongoing basis. And yes, I see my health app within my cell phone, then I can see some of the how many steps I'm taking to take step by step measure and monitoring to increase my health, and in our case, cyber resilience maturity. There's resilience, right? We don't have to do a big jump and spending lots of money. I'm going to get the Peloton in my garage or whatever that is. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, hey, how
Well,
can we count the steps, per day, or, how many stretch I did during the week?
so let's go back to 1428, 14028. It's come up in the chat. You've brought it up. When 140028 came out, I'll bring this up because it's Christmas. The joke was it was Ghosts of Christmas Past. There was nothing in that executive order that hadn't appeared before, right? It was really out there, like, we're really serious about it this time, and here's what we're going to do to show you we're serious about it. A big part of what's happened is now that the world has gone digital, 60% of global revenue is digital. More than half the assets driving corporate valuations are intangible, which means data and software, which is why boards are now concerned about cyber, right? There's a lot of pieces there, but it comes down to the enforcement, right? And that's why if you look at like the National Cybersecurity strategy, they talk about the 2 R's. I threw the third in there, resilience. They talk about responsibility. So that's what's going on now, is actually providing some accountability. Because there's a certain percentage of any market that's going to do what makes sense. They're going to see it as a competitive advantage, which I believe in. But there's also a percentage that will only do what they absolutely have to do. And SMBs need special considerations, but we don't have enough time for that today.
So because of the time, so now we have been boiling down into the 3 engagement approach. Known the unknown. Correct me if I'm wrong. Whatever the unknown would be, we don't know what we don't know. So find a way to know what you don't know. Where there is GRC gaps, technology controls, find a way to do it. And we talked about using CIS for all this time. It's one of the common security framework because they have a lot of controls mapping that correlate between the two.
Yep.
Second step, building blocks, one step at a time. Find out, after you find out what we don't know, or in my organization, where are we weak at? Tap into expertise like you, Alex, to fill in that gap with the fractional engagements. That's the building block, one block at a time. We don't need to build a castle overnight. We need to build a small moat or just lock up the window one at a time. And then the third is continuous measure and monitoring, starting from very basic, from if your organization doesn't have vulnerability scanning tools, and one of our member talked about open source, OpenVAS is available, Nasus is available. And if you're telling me your IT team doesn't even know how to deploy that, time to look at that gap.
That's a different problem.
Yeah.
That's a different problem.
That's a different problem, but it's at least that from that process, you identify, oh, you know what? Hey, we have not even deployed a vulnerability scanning tool. That is a huge problem.
Those are huge problems. And if you look at the nature of the attacks and where breaches come from, the number one source is misconfigurations.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. That's why we tied it back to CIS. And Alex, you and I started because of that conversation. You know them really well. You know the founder.
I used to.
That's why
we all used to work together.
Yeah.
When we all had hair.
and I started, NetSwitch started at the same time they started. So that goes back into 23 years ago. So this is nothing new. This is basically, as a member or even not member,
Goes to
leverage
sources
what they have.
past.
Yeah, and all the information is there, and that's why we're still wondering why haven't most of the people building their guidelines based on that CSF, Common Security Framework, because
Yes.
it's a lot of information is already available. Now,
Yes. So
yes, we are making it automated to do this contextual correlations. We're just adding on top of that at this point on what we're doing.
yeah,
Sorry,
and if you
Alex.
look at no, this is a good conversation. If you looked at what's going on with the CSF in particular, they're upgrading it, and if you look at the changes to the CSF, the most visual change is they're adding the governance piece to it, and that's like, okay, it only took you 30 years, you know, should have been there for a while. And I don't look, I have an incredible amount of respect for NIST and that team, but it's always frustrated me that we forget the governance piece, right? So it's finally in there. But if you look at the different sections, we're starting to talk more and more about systemic risk. We're talking about supply chain. We're talking, we're talking about all the places that we really get hurt. We're upgrading it to be more of a cloud model, right? So there's a lot of good stuff going on. There is a comment in the chat I do want to bring up about the SEC
Bring that up too.
reporting.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, these forms, these 10Ks, the 10Qs, the 8Ks, all the different forms, which by the way, if you've ever read one, it could be a mind-numbing exercise. I highly recommend adult beverages. They're 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 very structured forms, and the same information generally appears in annual reports, but there's a reason people read the annual report. That is all up because we are talking about transparency here. Those forms, when they're filled out, they go to a public database called EDGAR, EDGAR. And we know that foreign powers, including hackers, different types of malicious actors, do leverage what's contained in the EDGAR database. So one of the challenges we're going to see with these incident reportings is determining where that line is between providing transparency to stakeholders and shareholders. There's a difference. Shareholders actually own the stock. A stakeholder has an interest. So like a financier, a vendor, or a customer, or whatever. Where do we provide them enough visibility so they can make informed decisions while not giving the bad guys too much information? So when the SEC came out with the proposed rules, I was actually part of a couple of different responses. This is something we wrestled with. And if you want to pull down the comments, they're on the public website. But I think this is an area we're going to be spending a lot of time on as these incident occurs, because right now most of the conversation around is what is material, what isn't material. Incidents start to flow. It's going to turn into a conversation about what do I put in this response, and those are judgment calls.
With that judgment call, I think it's time for us to wrap it up. That's why we're going to go into overtime. And Alex, as usual, it's a great pleasure to have you. And it's wonderful talking to you. And we will continue to have this dialogue based on our audience feedback, and let us know what you want us based on this very, I was hoping to try to narrow it down into more of an ultimate guideline to simplifying things. But of course, we're dealing with a very complex and confusing subject. So I would love to hear your comment. What do you like us to focus on? So I can arrange, we can arrange with another chat with Alex and help you along with that process. And until then, thank you very much for your time. Alex, again, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have you as
You
usual.
left us with more questions than answers this time, Alex, as you usually do.
Hey, you know, it's the
But
end.
these are great questions. Right?
But
You
it's
know, I'm trying to get the questions out there that we need to address because we as an industry need to, you know, we have a lot of loose ends to tie up.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And the only way to tie up those loose ends is to, you know, start getting them out on the table, you know, just like,
Communications.
yep.
Communications would lead to collaborations. And
It
if
always
you
does.
don't know what we're talking about, go look us up in the LinkedIn Cyber Risk Governance Group. Until next time, thank you very much for all of your time. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex.
Bye-bye.
Anything I can do. Have a great one, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.